Yeah, so thanks everybody, and thank you for all of your interest in coming to today's meeting, and thank you Eric and Karen and all the organizers for spearheading this effort. It's appreciated. Like Eric had mentioned, this is a work group that was going pretty well until the recent retirement of Michael Jurdy, and so we're trying to get it reinvigorated again. So this is great. My name is Kris Jones, for those of you who don't know me, and I am one of the 1.5 PYs or staff for the California Water Quality Monitoring Council. I serve as the assistant director. What I figured we would do today, just because many of you may not be as familiar with the Monitoring Council and its efforts, I'll be giving just a brief introduction about the council and how it was formed, and kind of the goals of the council, and kind of the roles that we're thinking that the Safe to Swim work group could play moving forward. So I'll go to the next slide.
Working on it.
No worries. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. So the Monitoring Council was created in response to legislation that was passed back in 2006, Senate Bill 1070. And the legislation essentially tasked the council with kind of a dual charge. First was to try to improve coordination among monitoring efforts that relate to water quality and ecosystem health statewide. And then also trying to make sure that the data that are collected from those oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if somebody was asking a question. And then, also just trying to make sure that the data that were collected from these various monitoring efforts, that they're available via the internet. And so, go on to the next slide. And so, in 2007, in response to the legislation, the Monitoring Council was formed after an MOU was signed between the Cal EPA and Natural Resources Agency. And so that's where the agency secretaries for Cal EPA and Natural Resources signed the MOU to essentially require that the different organizations within those two agencies should take part in these efforts, and that they saw value in the work that we were doing. And so they created the Monitoring Council in response to that legislation. And so, like I mentioned, the council has a statewide scope. It includes, all surface waters, along with the associated ecosystem and wildlife populations and habitats and groundwater. So groundwater is something that we haven't really gotten into yet, but just with the recent droughts, we've been kind of thinking about potentially expanding to that as well. But so it's a pretty broad scope. The strategy for the council has been to, our two charges that we were initially charged with from Senate Bill 1070 was, like I mentioned, to try to improve coordination and collaboration. And so to do that, we've created our theme-specific work groups. And so we have work groups that focus on different areas of water quality and ecosystem health. So obviously Safe to Swim is one of those. But then we also have groups that look into drinking water safety or harmful algal blooms, and also wetlands. So in our ecosystem health work groups, we have wetland work group, or a wetland monitoring work group, the estuaries work group, and Healthy Watersheds Partnership. And so there are a variety of groups that look at different questions. A lot of these groups formed through kind of the beneficial uses kind of framework that we were kind of initially, that was kind of part of our initial charge, was kind of using some of the beneficial uses to kind of structure the council. And then kind of for that second charge of trying to make the data from those monitoring efforts available, the Monitoring Council has created its theme-specific portals. And so so that's one of the things that we'll probably talk about today at some point, is trying to make data available in a form that is not just accessible to resource managers or scientists, but the public. And so the council has really strived to try to have the portals be accessible to a variety of audiences, and especially for the work groups that focus on questions like, the Safe to Swim work group, where it's very important for public safety and public awareness, to try to make the content really accessible and user-friendly for a general audience and the public. So that's kind of the gist of what the council's background and goals. Move on maybe to the next slide. So more recently, the council has been going through some kind of reflections, trying to think through our lessons learned. We had a triennial audit a few years ago, which is part of the our strategy and I think mentioned in our MOU with Cali PA Natural Resources that we would do these regular kind of reviews, those triennial audits, and so those audits during the last audit, which was in 2014, December of 2014, I believe, we had all the work groups kind of reflect on how they were doing in terms of performing relative to our strategy and the performance measures that were in our strategy document. And so we had a lot of lessons learned at that point. We tried to learn and adapt from the feedback that we were receiving from the various work groups. And so one of the things that we are now doing is trying to update our strategy to try to adapt to the feedback that we received, but also the work or from some other recent legislation that's been passed in more recent years. And so there was a recent legislation that some of you may be familiar with, AB 1755, which is the Open and Transparent Water Data Act. And that legislation has a very similar charge to the Monitoring Council, and it was essentially an act that required that basically all state agencies and even federal agencies just make their data available through a centralized platform or portal. And so it kind of was focusing on some of the areas that the council strategy was kind of covering. So we're currently going through some modifications to try to adapt to the current climate, those current efforts. And so one of the things that we had recently done was we formed a subcommittee. We've established some different areas where we felt that the council adds value, and this is kind of relevant for the discussions today because some of those may relate to some of the discussions and efforts that this group may want to consider moving forward. So if you want to move on to the next slide. So we had during our discussions of what the council might want to consider, how we might want to change course and kind of shift our focus slightly and refine our mission. We had a subcommittee where we had those discussions to try to figure out where does the council add value? Where does it add value for the state of California? And so there were 5 that kind of rose to the top, and I'll just kind of quickly go through those. But when I'm going through these, maybe think about what this work group, how they might be applied to what the work group be able to consider for efforts. So, for example, the first focus area, looking at whether or not the monitoring programs are actually designed effectively to answer the questions that are important for the relative efforts. So, for example, having performance measures to evaluate monitoring programs. We found through some of the work with the council that, though there's a lot of disparate different groups looking at different questions to kind of look at statewide questions of, whether it's water quality or ecosystem health related questions, that sometimes the monitoring programs don't really get at the questions that you need to answer. And so, for example, I'll just raise an example that's kind of a good one for the council's efforts was the wetland monitoring work group, for example. They formed around the central question of whether or not there are any no net loss of wetlands in California. But what they found by bringing together all these various partners, state and federal and tribal and various groups, that we don't actually collect the data and we don't have programs that actually would allow us to assess those questions. And that was a question that was highlighted by a previous administration as something that was an important question for the state of California to pursue. But what we found was that we just didn't have the data to actually assess that question. And so those are one of the examples of what we thought that the work groups may want to consider to see if there's ways that they can try to fill in those gaps and try to address questions better to actually achieve certain outcomes. So this next focus area was relating to data quality and methods consistency across monitoring programs. So as I mentioned, and is relevant for the various groups collecting the data that we're talking about today, is that there are different groups that are collecting data through various monitoring programs. Is there a way that the group could try to coordinate where possible to try to improve data quality standards and have a common, have resources to be able to support those different groups so that they can have similar data quality standards, so that there's at least a known and documented quality for those data that are being collected. In addition, just method consistency, so making sure that if data are pooled, that you can be able to answer questions effectively and correctly by pooling data from various sources, if possible. So those are some questions that this group may want to consider. Was there a question?
I'm sorry, just rustling.
Okay, no worries. And the third focus area was relating to the interpretation of data thresholds, so that you can be able to turn data into information. So essentially what that's meaning is that there's a lot of data that's being collected for various programs that there aren't really any thresholds that are established to be able to assess conditions. So one example is harmful algal blooms, that this has really become more of an issue in recent years, particularly with the drought, where we're having blooms occur throughout the state, but we currently don't really have any kind of thresholds or standards to be able to assess conditions, to be able to say if they're harmful conditions to be exposed to, for example. And so that's an area where the monitoring council's work groups are trying to get around to try to address those kind of needs and those questions. And so that may be something that in some instances may relate to the Safe to Swim work group, especially for the harmful algal bloom question is very relevant for swimming safety. And so there may be an opportunity for even collaboration with one of our other work groups, the harmful algal bloom or the CC-HAB group, moving forward, if that would be of interest to this group. And then if you want to go on to the next slide. And then the fourth focus area that the council highlighted was that there is a lot of different emerging technology and methods that are being developed. And what the council has realized is that the council could play a role in being able to support those needs. So for example, a lot of molecular methods are being used, which may be relevant for the Safe to Swim work group. So for example, using molecular methods to be able to assess different type of bacteria that are in the waters or other kind of things, and to be able to quickly assess conditions using molecular methods. The council has recognized that there are a lot of different agencies and groups and programs that are using molecular methods currently, but there really isn't a coordinating body to try to help to address how the data are collected, how they're quality controlled, how they're documented, all the different things that you might want to think about for coordinating that will help in a broader use of those data sets moving forward. And so the council has considered, for example, for the molecular methods, we're in the process of trying to form a work group to try to statewide coordinate the different groups that are using these methods and to try to address different challenges and questions so that we're looking at these things in a more efficient and coordinated manner. So, so that's another effort that maybe this group might want to consider looping into for one of the other council's efforts, or play a part in that as we move forward. And the last one was just relating to another topic that's very relevant to this group, is just trying to support the coordination of various monitoring programs that are from local and regional entities and other groups to try to coordinate those efforts across the state. And so what we are looking to do is trying to create opportunities. We discussed this at the last monitoring council meeting to try to brainstorm how we could kind of bring in some of the more smaller local groups. But what we're doing is trying to apply these kind of these opportunities to some of the other groups that are currently in existence, or even the Safe to Swim work group, to try to see if there are opportunities to just bring these groups together for coordination, whether they're bigger monitoring programs statewide that we want to kind of combine efforts as is relevant for this group, or just trying to bring in citizen monitoring groups and other groups that might be collecting data and try to engage those groups in a way that we could kind of leverage the various monitoring programs and or efforts that are taking place statewide. So, so these are some of the various areas that the council was seeing that we could help to kind of really focus on moving forward, that that we're trying to identify opportunities that are kind of unique to the council and ways that we can try to kind of adapt to some of the other kind of related efforts that have been sprung up, like I mentioned, the AB 1755 effort, and to try to kind of carve out a niche that's unique to the council. And so, so that's kind of the gist for those focus areas. With that, that's kind of the background on the council and kind of where we're moving forward. With that, I'll hand it over to Eric. He'll provide some kind of context and background for the Safe to Swim work group that may be helpful to kind of